Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. With coronavirus cases increasing by over 300,000 a day for the last 6 days and mathematically projected to possibly touch 1 million a day by the middle of May, what impact will this have on the economy? And secondly, what are the steps the government must take, in particular, to protect the weak and vulnerable? Those are two key issues I shall raise today with one of India's most highly recognized economists and the country's former Chief Statistician, Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, as I said in the introduction, for the last 6 days, coronavirus has been growing by over 300,000 a day, and Michigan University has mathematically projected that by the middle of May, the number of cases in terms of daily increase could touch 1 million. Clearly, India is not just a frightened country, it's a country close to panic. So before I come to physical lockdowns, let me ask you, what impact will this shroud of panic and fear have on the economy?
Karan, any form of fear has very substantial effects on the economic system because what it does is it changes people's behavior. Now, so if we simply look at the fear factor, all right, during the first wave of corona in the country, there wasn't that much fear. Not because just the numbers were low, the numbers were pretty high even then, but much more importantly, the death toll was very low. What is making things a lot more complicated now is that the death toll has gone up and has gone up very significantly. Now that is going to create much greater fear and a much greater sense of self-protection. Now, if you think about how that's going to play out, one thing is fairly clear, which is that all projections that we had, which suggested that the economy would go back to the financial year 20 level of GDP, either this year itself or at worst by the middle of next financial year. I think those assumptions are dead. And the reason for it is that what those projections required was that services come back to where they were pre-corona. That clearly is not going to happen, not at least while the disease spread continues to go on. Now, if you look at all indicators, this is going to go on. It may peak sometime in May, but it's going to be around till June or July, which means that the first quarter recovery of services is simply not going to happen. It won't be as bad as it was during the first quarter of last year, because last year there was a lockdown. We don't have that. Well, that we may come to later. But what will happen is that services are going to be badly impacted. Insofar as agriculture and manufacturing are concerned, the real issue is what is going to happen in terms of employers keeping their factories going without vaccination. If there is a pushback from workers, and there's very likely to be a pushback, then the employers may actually have to cut production schedules simply because the number of workers will not be available. The tricky one, Karan, is agriculture. Last time around, again, I said, let's not talk about the lockdown period. Let's talk about when COVID actually started peaking, which was the latter half of the year, to September onwards. At that time, rural India was virtually unaffected. There was virtually no fear in rural India. That has changed. And that has changed quite dramatically. Now, how this is going to play out is really going to be the question. My sense is that agricultural production will be fine, but agricultural supply chains may get seriously affected.
Can I ask you a quick
And so
question
we may
about?
get into a situation.
Can I ask you a quick question about
Sure,
agriculture before I
sure.
come to the impact of lockdowns on the rest of the economy? Because you say the big difference between September last year and now is the fear factor, and
Yes.
because you believe that in fact it's a dramatic change, are you worried that agriculture, which kept the economy growing last year, may not play that role this year? Agriculture grew by 3% last year. Do you expect some sort of decline this year?
In terms of production, I don't actually see a decline. The problem is that last year, agricultural output was sold pretty much quite effectively. So rural incomes were okay, and it was rural demand which held up the economy. This time around, if people are fearful of going to markets, if the hearts don't happen, if people will not go to stores which are in the neighboring town, then the rural demand which propped up the economy last year may not play out this time around. That is the problem. Production may not be affected very much. It's not going to be 3% plus because we are already coming off a boom year. So, but it should be somewhere in the 2.5 to 3% range. But will it generate the rural incomes that it did last year and which kept the economy as a whole afloat?
That's a very important point. Now, I'll underline it. Your great fear is that agricultural production may not suffer by very much. It might not be 3%, but it might be somewhere between 2 and 3%. But fear may prevent farmers and rural people from spending. Rural demand, therefore, will not prop up the economy in the way it did last year. And that will be a major minus for India's performance, because last year rural demand kept the economy going. This year, out of fear, rural demand may diminish substantially. Let's at this point talk about the fear of physical lockdowns. As you know, several state governments have begun declaring 2 week or 1 week lockdowns or night curfews. The central government yesterday advised them to declare containment zones in areas where there is more than 10% positivity. And there is an estimate that perhaps something like 70 to 80% of the country could come under some form of economic restraint. And these areas include states like Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, which are major contributors to the Indian economy. And we don't know how long these lockdowns or this restriction on activity will continue. So, do you have any sense of what this will do to the Indian economy during this financial year? Or is it just impossible to think of it at this point of time?
Karan, if you listen to yourself, in a sense, you've answered your own question. Everything about policy action in terms of lockdown has become uncertain. Last year, the lockdown was a certainty. People could work around that. There was no uncertainty involved. Today, you have a situation where there is no certainty. You may not be locked down today, but the Damocles sword of being locked down tomorrow exists. How would you behave as a person? Normally, you'd assume the worst and say, I could be locked down tomorrow, and I will behave accordingly. That uncertainty is actually a lot more damaging. Now, it has a whole bunch of ramifications, right? Now, if I am looking at a lockdown in the future, I will be stocking up today in the eventuality that I am not able to access my essential goods and services later. So, what you're doing, in a sense, is bringing forward the demand. Much worse, investments which were already badly hit, companies were not taking new investment decisions. This simply makes it worse because you do not know that whether or not your preferred location to set up a unit is going to be locked down in the middle of your investment program. So it is the uncertainty which is extremely damaging. All critical decisions which affect growth are going to be negatively affected.
That is very important. All critical decisions that affect growth will be negatively affected. In this context, let me put to you, on Saturday, the State Bank of India released a report where they have estimated that the economic loss would be 1.5 trillion, and they believe 55% of that is accounted by Maharashtra alone. Now, admittedly, that report is probably worked upon before Saturday, and therefore before some of the lockdowns we're talking about happened. How credible is that figure of 1.5 trillion today, or do you think it's fairly substantially overtaken by the uncertainty?
Karan, I would hesitate. Last year, I didn't. I actually made estimates as to what the effect of Corona and the lockdown would be. Today, I hesitate to make any projection. And the reason for that is because we are faced with a degree of uncertainty which makes any projection, and I repeat, any projection, completely speculative. And the point is, I understand, financial institutions have to make projections. But the point is that will you keep revising the projections? Would that actually make your credibility better or worse?
That's a very good point. That's a very good point you're making, that we've reached a level of uncertainty so much greater than last year, on the back of the sense of fear and panic, which is considerably greater than last year, that it has now become almost impossible to make projections. We simply would be guessing, if that. In that context, then, let me talk to you specifically about migrant workers. They were a great cause of concern last year. We know from images on television and newspapers that already sizable numbers have begun to depart back to their villages. The State Bank of India, relying upon data from Central Railways and Western Railways, has calculated that perhaps 1 million have left Maharashtra between the 1st and 12th of April. I would guess that in the subsequent 15 days, that figure of 1 million might even have doubled. After all, Maharashtra has been in lockdown, and that fear would have grown. What impact will that size of reverse migration in Maharashtra have on a state that contributes 14% of India's economy?
It depends. Remember, the return migration, that is, people coming back from the villages to the cities, happen fairly quickly. So the real issue is the perception of how long the lockdown is going to last. The bigger damage, and this is a damage which we will not know because we are again not calculating it, is that if you have a high fear factor, both in terms of disease progression, as well as in terms of policy response in terms of lockdowns, you're going to be seeing people migrating out of locations where lockdowns have not happened.
Quite right.
And we will not know because we will not be tracking it. Maharashtra, Delhi, Bangalore, we will track because lockdowns exist. What about the rest of the country?
In other words,
now that is spreading to, the smaller towns, cities and towns, you may have, and that's where most of the migrants are, by the way. They are not sitting in the metros. Will they be going home? The
So
answer is quite likely. We
the
don't know.
overall size of the reverse migration could be considerably greater, because it's not simply now as a result of lockdowns and the loss of jobs and livelihoods, it's also because of fear. And if it begins to happen from small 2-tier and 3-tier towns where you believe the majority of migrants anyway work, then we may not even have a way of tracking the quantum and size of the reverse migration. In other words,
You
the
would have a
problem
problem
this year
because,
the problem this year could be much greater than last year.
well, I don't know whether it could be greater, but the fact of the matter is last year's experience is etched in the minds of all migrant workers. I mean, they literally went through hell. None of them wants to repeat that experience. So what they will be doing is preempting. They will be going on expectations rather than actuality.
Absolutely. Before I come to what steps the government should take, let me put to you one more interpretation or analysis of the lockdown and the impact on the economy. This time, it's from a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Sajid Chennoi. He was writing on Saturday in the Business Standard, and he believes that the combined impact, both of the surge in infection as well as the lockdowns, will be A, heterogeneous, because in different states it will be a different impact. B, it will be asynchronous, because it will happen at different times in different states. But thirdly, he says it will be less enduring than last year, because this time around we have vaccines to fight back with. Do you agree with that overall impression?
Uh, yes, and that's what we've been talking about. That is what the uncertainty factor is all about. The point is whether or not Sajid's take on the duration and impact is right or not, I think is questionable. I mean, I think there are a few features you really have to look at, Karan. If you think about last year, because of the national lockdown, the RBI took a number of steps to ensure that production units didn't go under. So you had moratorium on loans, you had additional loans being given to companies to restart operations and so on and so forth. At the moment, none of that is happening.
Absolutely.
Right?
Let me just stop
So,
there, because I want to take you through the measures both that have been announced, and they're very, very few, as well as those that have not been announced, and ask you in each case what the impact of not announcing them would be. Let's start with what the government has announced, particularly, I imagine, with the weak, the vulnerable, and migrant workers in mind. This is on top of what the Delhi and Maharashtra governments have announced. The only thing significant from the central government is the announcement of 5 kilograms of additional grain for 800 million beneficiaries of the National Food Security Act. But unlike last year, there is no income support. And this 5 kilograms is only for 2 months at the moment, May and June. Should there be income support?
well, I think the experience with income support last year wasn't great. Um, at this point in time, I think the food grain support is really more important. The provision of free food grains has an effect where the person can actually buy less of food grains from the market, which is an income support in a sense, right? That's a decision that the person is taking. The real question, I don't have an answer to it because I haven't seen the rules that the government has framed for giving this 5 kilo, is whether or not the beneficiary can take the 5 kilos before he has exhausted his normal ration quantity. Or does this come after that? The right way to do it is that it should come before. You take your free 5 kilos and then you buy whatever extra you need. If you turn it around, then it's ineffective.
Absolutely. And if you turn it around, the disguised income support, because you're getting a certain amount of free food grade, will not be realized. You will have to spend your own money to buy food grade before you get the free one. I take your point. It's a very important one. Let's come to another section of the economy: MSMEs and standalone shopkeepers. Now, they will be badly hit by the lockdown. Last time around, there was a debt moratorium to help them. This time, so far, there's no talk of a debt moratorium. Should there be one?
Yes, but it would have to be different in nature, because earlier, because the lockdown was a national lockdown, you could give the debt moratorium across the board to everybody. Those who chose not to accept it could opt out. But at the moment, given what is happening, given the uncertainties, I think a moratorium is important. But the way you really need to think about it is you should turn the decision around, saying that everybody is eligible for a moratorium, but you have to actually come and ask for it.
In other words, the initiative will be on the person who needs it to go and
That's
say,
right.
I want it.
Because no bank knows whether that person has been affected adversely or not.
Quite right. So leave it to those who need it to realize their situation and take the step, but announce that everyone is eligible.
That's right.
It's simply the initiative that's left to the person thereafter to say, I want what I'm eligible for.
That's right.
What about substantially increasing the NREGA allocation? If sizable numbers of migrant workers go back to their villages, and we were a moment ago talking about the uncertainty and we don't know how many will go back, but if they do, they will need jobs. And NREGA could be a lifeline for them. So should the government substantially increase the allocation?
Karan, let me go back to what I was saying at the beginning of our discussion, which is this time around, agricultural incomes are likely to be hit, rural incomes at large, by the way, much more severely than they were last year. If that is the case, you certainly need NREGA to be stepped up substantially, not necessarily for migrants, but for the permanent rural residents whose income could be adversely affected. They may have the production, they may not have the income, and NREGA will give them that income. So it should be increased and increased more substantially than you did last year.
So far, the government is silent about debt moratoriums for MSMEs and standalone shopkeepers. It's silent about any increase in NREGA. The uncertainty is already palpable. The fear and panic is undeniable. Is the government's silence on these two matters inexplicable?
It is. Maybe it is just sheer optimism that they hope the problem will just go away by itself.
Okay, that sounds very much like, as Ashok Mangalsham said, hope against hope. But never mind, the government is entitled, I suppose, in a state of paralysis to hope it will suddenly disappear. One more thing. Last year, there was a lot of talk that we need an urban equivalent of NREGA. It didn't happen. Do we need it now, or is it something the government simply cannot afford in these circumstances?
No, the point, Karan, is this need was recognized a year ago. 1 year has gone by, we've done nothing. If we start designing an urban NREGA today, that may actually come onto the field after the problem has gone away in its totality. It takes a long period to design, to get through all the approvals, to set the institutional structure in place. Jean Dresse has been talking about this, and he's been talking about it since the middle of last year. But there's been no progress. The question is, have we missed the bus? And we may well have.
In other words, this is
Because vaccination may make this completely unnecessary.
we'll come to vaccination in a moment in time, but actually what you're saying is that designing and then rolling out an urban NREGA is something the government should have been working on at least 9-10 months ago. And because it hasn't, because it's been lackadaisical, let's use a polite euphemism, it may have missed the bus on it. Because even if it works on it now, it can only roll out when hopefully in 8 months' time the present crisis is over. Let me put you something else. Because people believe that the impact will be heterogeneous and asynchronous, it's also believed that the response needs to be state specific rather than a one-size-fits-all nationwide approach announced by the center. In other words, leave the responsibility to the states, let them design what they believe they need given their particular circumstances, which they understand better because they're there immediately on the ground. Do you agree with that view?
I agree with that view with a proviso. And that proviso is important, which is that somebody has to finance all of this. Right? One of the most interesting things that's happened in the recent past, Karan, is that every state government budget that we have seen has actually reduced the state fiscal deficit below their mandated 3%. Every one of them. Question is why? And the answer to that is because the states, I think, firmly believe they need a certain amount of buffer space so that in the eventuality of what we are seeing across a number of states today, they would be able to raise the resources without having to come to the center with a begging bowl in hand. So they've all kept a buffer of somewhere around 0.25 to 0.3% of GDP for that eventuality.
But you're making a very interesting point. You're saying even those states have the capacity to increase expenditure because they have that buffer, they've retained it because they were apprehensive that should there be another calamity, they would not then have the space to spend. Now, when they need to spend, should the central government, to encourage them, immediately increase their borrowing limits so that even if they at state level expand their expenditure, they still have buffers for the uncertain future, because at this moment of uncertainty, they won't know how much they need to spend.
That's right. No, I think that's a great suggestion, Karan. I mean, at the very least, take it up to the 3.5% that you permitted last year.
In other words, you're saying that if the central government believes that this time around the response has to be state specific, it must enable the states by immediately, not 2-3 months down the road, but immediately increasing their borrowing limits. This is a decision that should be announced literally in the next 48 hours.
Yes, indeed.
Now, so far, Professor Sen, we've spoken of lockdowns on the assumption that they will be regional or district, and on the assumption that they will be of short duration, 1 week or 2 weeks. But we don't know how the virus will surge. And we don't know what will be the fear impact on the psychology of the Indian people. If therefore the virus forces the country into a prolonged nationwide lockdown, does the central government have the fiscal and monetary space for a second nationwide extensive lockdown relief package? In other words, can they afford to say the fiscal deficit target, which is meant to be 6.8%, will bounce right back to the 9 and 10% levels of last year? Can they afford to do that?
Perhaps they can, but that is not the issue. I think the real issue is that would a national lockdown reduce the fear factor substantially or not? If it does not, then it is a lose-lose decision.
You're saying, in fact, that a national lockdown could compound the fear factor. In other
That
words,
is
it
correct.
will build and enhance
That
apprehension.
is parts of the country where this was not playing out would now start looking over their shoulders.
In other words, you're also saying that a national lockdown would be inadvisable at this point of time.
I believe so.
And that in turn means that the question I asked about, do we have fiscal space for an extensive relief package to cater for a national lockdown, that question is overtaken, because if there is no lockdown, there is no need for that relief package either.
No. The same amount would not be necessary. But as I said, that if the center was going to support the states, then resources will have to be found.
Well, let's talk.
Increasing states' borrowing limits is one way, but it is no substitute for direct central support.
Let's come to that question of direct central support, because this requirement for additional expenditure by the center is not just sudden, it's also unplanned. And it will happen at a time when the collapse of economic activity will diminish revenues. Taxes will suffer, and the government's capacity to fulfill its privatization ambition or its asset sales plans will also suffer. That will be a double whammy for the center, won't it? How should the center respond?
Oh yes, it will. In fact, I have always maintained, and I will say it again, this is the wrong time for privatization. Unless you're very clear that the privatization will be to foreign investors. Privatization, number one, it creates a fair amount of uncertainty, it creates a lot of disruption, but much more importantly, it sucks out whatever resources that may have otherwise gone into new investment projects. What we need now are new projects. We don't need old units changing hands. That is not critical at this stage. Do that by all means, but do it a year later.
One corollary of your concern about the timing of privatization is that how then does the government raise revenue at a time when taxes will be diminishing because economic activity is down, and yet the demand for expenditure will have gone up fairly sizably? How does the government get that revenue? Or do they accept that that fiscal deficit target of 6.8 will have to shoot up?
Well, if you look at the revenue numbers, government revenues haven't done badly at all. The fact of the matter is, after the last lockdown and the play out of the economy subsequent to that, there's been a dramatic change in income distributions, both on the production side as well as the consumption side. Production has shifted to entities which are much more tax compliant. On the consumption side, consumption patterns have moved towards product, because the income distribution has worsened, has moved to products where the tax rates are higher. As a result, taxes have done very well, thank you.
In which case, you're also suggesting that because revenues have done quite well and haven't suffered as many people fear, the government may not need to allow the fiscal deficit to rise very much and still be able to meet the additional demand for expenditure in terms of relief.
As of now, a national lockdown will certainly affect revenues, because there will be no transaction at that point, right? But the sporadic lockdowns, transactions will continue to happen. So there will be some tax impact, but nothing as dramatic as what we saw during the national lockdown.
And that means the impact on the fiscal deficit won't be particularly worrying.
It won't be anywhere as large. That's correct.
At that point, then, let's come to an issue you touched on a moment ago, and I deliberately said I'd leave it to the end. How important in these circumstances, in fact, let me use the word, how critical is a massive, if not aggressive, vaccination campaign that targets 5 to 10 million people a day? How critical is that to ensure that the economy recovers, the fear factor is overcome, and people are willing to get back to work?
Karan, we are in a foot race. Can we vaccinate faster than the disease is spreading? That's really the question.
Your answer seems to be no, we can't.
Yes, we can. The point is, are we doing it? Have we mobilized systems to be able to do it? That's
There is
the
one,
question.
there is one problem. It's not just mobilizing systems, it's not just putting an effective plan and executing it that is missing. What about the actual production of vaccines? We only produce under 2.5 million a day. Therefore, we cannot vaccinate more than 2.5 million. Secondly, Sputnik, which is the first vaccine that's likely to be added to the two that exist, won't come on the market probably till the end of May, and in very small quantities because it'll have to be imported. After that, if we're depending upon Johnson & Johnson and Sputnik and others actually manufacturing in India, or if we're depending upon AstraZeneca and Bharat Biotech expanding their production, we're talking about deadlines of June and July. So that means that we're going to have to continue with levels of vaccination somewhere around 2.5, 2.6, 2.7 million a day for at least another 2.5, 3 months.
This is correct. So the question there, and this again is something as an economist I cannot answer. This is for epidemiologists to answer, is what should be our strategy in terms of our vaccination rollout? That's the critical issue.
Epidemiologists.
So far, our strategy has been essentially an age-based strategy. And this has been nationwide, mandated by the government. The point is, given what you're talking about, given the fact that our availability of vaccines is about half of what it should be, is a purely age-based strategy the right approach, or should it be an age-geography-based strategy?
In fact,
I don't know.
Epidemiologists like Pronab Mukherjee at Michigan University, whose mathematical projections I was referring to when I said that we could end up with 1 million infections a day by the middle of May, have also said the government needs to switch to what's called ring vaccination. In other words, you identify areas where you believe the problem is at its worst, you identify demographies and geographies that you need to tackle first and approach them. For a while, at any rate, you put on the back burner your equitable nationwide approach and concentrate on the areas of greatest concern. That's been raised in questions to the government. The government has not changed its strategy. It hasn't really explained why the concept of ring vaccination doesn't appeal to it. So we carry on without knowing why we're not changing. That is the situation.
That is true. And I really cannot address that issue. That's not my competence.
Absolutely. But as an economist, you can tell me that if we're going to overcome the fear factor, which retards people's entire attitude and willingness to work, and if we're going to end the lockdowns so that there's no danger in working of getting an infection, then mass vaccination is perhaps the best stimulus.
Absolutely. No question about it. If we could roll out mass vaccination and roll it out quickly, I think a lot of the problem would be taken care of. The fear factor would recede by itself.
Absolutely.
The point is, if you can't, then what happens?
Absolutely. And in these circumstances, the government's silence about changing vaccine strategy, or even its response to why it disagrees with the sort of advice it's getting from people like Pronab Mukherjee, is again inexplicable. The government needs to talk to us and explain to us and share its thinking with us, because that again will reassure people. But the government's silence only adds to the uncertainty.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does indeed.
We're coming to the end of this interview, Professor Sen. The government was very confident that this year the economy would grow at 11%. Given the incredible surge in the virus, and we don't know when it will peak and when it will end. Given the lockdowns that have begun and we don't know how they will proliferate and how long they will last, and given the fear factor, which has become panic, can 11% be achieved this year? I know you can't give a definitive answer because there are still 11 months to go, but can 11% be achieved, or do we need to be realistic and say that's an ambition that has to be scaled down?
No, I don't think 11% can be achieved. What 11% means, Karan, is that this year we would go beyond the 1920 GDP level, this year itself. I don't think that's happening. And it isn't happening essentially because services will take much longer to resume. And that's where the vaccination becomes important, because that's the only policy measure that we have in terms of addressing the fear factor, which is driving the services issue.
In which case, my last question, the government was very confident, at times even boastful, that we were experiencing a V-shaped recovery. Now, do you think the letter W or the letter U is a better description?
Well, I've always believed that the government was being overly optimistic about the V. I've always believed that it would be a kind of an extended U. I see no reason to change that. In fact, things have become marginally worse than what I had expected. But in any case, I think the government itself is starting to recognize that this is more a K than a V, which is that you're seeing two parts of the economy, one part recovering very quickly, very much like a V, another part which is going down. I think that recognition is there.
My last question. Do you think, from everything that you've seen and heard from the government, that the response we're getting is adequate?
At the moment, I really haven't seen any response worth the while, other than the 5 kilo food, which I think is an important, credible step. But the point is that unless action is taken now, there can be serious damage to the production structure, because a lot of accounts may become NPAs unless some kind of a moratorium is extended.
In other words, unless serious action is taken now, there can be serious damage. You're saying time is not on the government side.
Time has never been on our side.
So the government should act immediately, not wait and dawdle.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
We've had too long a period of lull.
Can you say that again? We've had too long a period of lull, did you say?
Lull, that's right.
In other words, government inaction has gone on for too long.
That's right. That time should have been spent on contingency planning.
This is hinting at irresponsibility. This is something the government or its advisors should have been aware of and acting upon. Not to have acted suggests they either deliberately didn't or they weren't aware of the situation. Either way, it sounds irresponsible.
Well, I think I think the government believed that the problem was going away. That is, Corona was in retreat, the vaccines had come on the scene, and therefore the game was won. I think Corona proved us grievously wrong, and we will be paying the price for it. Let's hope the vaccine rollout is faster than.
Let me just end by pointing this out to you. The belief that we had defeated Corona, which is what the Prime Minister said at the World Economic Forum, which is what the BJP said in its resolution on the 21st of February, which is what the Health Minister said to an assembly of doctors on the 7th or 8th of March. That belief was totally wrong. The government, therefore, was the prisoner of a wrong judgment. Let me put it euphemistically. The government's judgment was wrong.
Well, Karan, no, I think we all believed it. I mean, let's not put the
Okay.
government being some sort of an outlier. I think we all believed it. The difference is that it's the government's job to do contingency planning.
And it didn't.
We've been doing it ourselves. All of us have,
But the
for
government
ourselves.
didn't.
The point is, I don't think there was contingency planning in the government.
All right.
At least I have not heard of it.
That failure to contingency plan, would you say that is tantamount to irresponsibility?
I think so.
Thank you, Professor Sen. I thank you for this interview. I thank you for comprehensively taking the audience through the situation that exists and underlining the uncertainty that prevails and the sense of fear that dominates people, which will affect their economic activity. And it's those two, uncertainty and fear, that make the situation today feel so much worse than last year. Take care, Professor Sen. Look after yourself and stay well.
Thank you, Karan. Enjoyed it.